Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the Jewish calendar. Seasons and times were an important part of Jewish life and culture throughout Bible times. We have been specifically looking at the book of John, so we're going to start with that lens to examine seasons in the Jewish calendar. If you're only interested in a more general overview, I'll put in a timestamp you can skip to. But the author of John considered seasons and times relevant enough to include around 20 references to specific times of day, week, or year, or give others information about seasons. There are 3 references to time of day: the 6th hour in 4:6 and 19:14, and the 7th hour in 4:52. Most people seem to think that the hours started being counted at sunrise, making the 6th hour about noon. This is not fully certain, but time measurement in the ancient world is beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. The Sabbath, the 7th day of the week, is mentioned in 4 stories in chapters 5, 7, 9, and 19. A lot of the discussion revolves around what is permissible to do on the Sabbath as Jesus heals people on that day. 6 festivals or feasts are mentioned in John, including Passover in 3 stories in chapters 2, 6, and 11, and most of the rest of the book takes place over the time period around a Passover. Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, is specifically mentioned in chapter 7. The Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah, is specifically mentioned in chapter 10:22, and a generic festival is mentioned in 5:1. Scholars have used details from these accounts and from other gospel accounts to try to pinpoint the dates of Christ's birth, ministry, and death and resurrection. As far as I can tell, there is no scholarly consensus, though there are some arguments that are more convincing than others. That's further into the weeds than I want to go today, though. Today, I mainly want to focus on giving an introduction to the Jewish calendar, especially to Christians who may not be very familiar with it, so that when you are reading a text and a time of year or holiday is mentioned, you'll be better able to understand that context. Before I go on, I should mention, when I talk about, quote, the Jewish calendar, that makes it sound as if there's only one Jewish calendar that's been used forever by everybody, and that is not true. We will mainly talk about the Jewish calendar that is in use and fairly standardized today, but I recently read about a 364-day calendar that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, apparently used by the sect of the Essenes around the time of Christ. It's possible, even likely, that other sects had various calendar variations that they used, to say nothing of how the Greeks and Romans measured time. This is part of what makes pinpointing dates in the life of Christ tricky. We are not quite sure which calendar version the people living the account or writing the account may have been referencing. However, aside from the 364-day calendar, the Jewish calendars seem to have been generally lunar, or technically lunisolar. That means that the months follow the phases of the moon, starting and ending around the new moon, but that an extra month is added every 3 years or so that the months stay in the same seasons. This is different from the Muslim calendar, where months also follow the moon, but where every year is about 10 days shorter than the solar year. So Ramadan, for example, moves about 10 days earlier every year and thus cycles through the year. Let's pause for a minute and talk about what it means to have a lunar calendar in more detail. In my experience, many Americans are rather unfamiliar with the moon and its phases. As proof, I could offer up various children's books. It's common to talk about the moon rising or setting, but 9 times out of 10, the picture shows the wrong type of moon for what the words say is happening. It's a little thing, it's not that important, but the phases of the moon would have been hugely important to people living in Jesus' day. We have our phones and our watches to tell us what day it is. They had the moon. We have streetlights and headlights to light our way at night. They had the moon, and only some nights. So, because of this disproportionate importance of the moon to them versus to us, I think it is worth spending a few minutes talking about the phases of the moon. If you are already familiar, feel free to skip to the next section. I'll put a timestamp here. So we're starting with the new moon. Lunar calendars tend to start the new month with or just after the new moon. During the new moon phase, the moon rises and sets at roughly the same time as the sun. It is only during this phase that a solar eclipse can occur if the sun and moon are aligned in a way that the moon's shadow falls on the earth. If you've ever seen a solar eclipse, you know that the moon itself is not really visible before or after the eclipse. We only know it's there because it blocks the sun. This is because the dark side of the moon is facing the earth, and its relative proximity to the bright sun just overwhelms any light the moon would send to earth. This is true of every new moon phase, whether or not there is an eclipse. The moon just won't be visible, but if you could find it in the sky, it would be relatively close to the sun. As the position of the moon relative to the sun shifts, we start to see the crescent moon. It is the sighting of this crescent moon that traditionally signaled the start of a new month in a lunar calendar. Today, the Muslim calendar is still at least somewhat dependent on the actual sighting of the crescent moon, which could depend on clouds or other weather conditions, while the Jewish calendar is based on the calculated date of the new moon, with slight adjustments allowed for holidays to fall on certain days of the week if necessary. This crescent moon is called a waxing crescent because the bright portion will grow larger over time. Based on the lines of sight, you can also see that this moon is mostly up during the daytime. It will rise just after the sun, but won't be visible until just after sunset, when the light of the sun is blocked to allow us to see the much dimmer moon. It will set shortly after the sun has set, allowing for limited viewing time. As the moon continues to move around the earth, the waxing crescent will get larger and larger and be up for a longer period of time after sunset. About a week after the new moon, the waxing crescent will become a waxing half. At this point, the moon is up during roughly the second half of the day and the first half of the night. It may even be visible during the daytime, since its location in the sky will be farther from the sun. After the half moon comes the waxing gibbous, as the moon starts to look closer and closer to full. During this time, the moon is also up more of the night, though it may also be visible in the later afternoon or evening. About a week after the half moon, the moon will be full. It will rise at sunset and set at sunrise and be visible throughout the night. If you lived in ancient times and hoped to do any work or travel at night, the time around the full moon would be the best time for that if you needed light. It's worth noting that this is the only time that a lunar eclipse can occur if the sun and earth are aligned in a way that the earth's shadow falls on the moon. After the full moon, instead of waxing or growing larger, the moon starts waning or growing smaller and goes through the same phases in reverse. The first phase is the waning gibbous. This can be differentiated from the waxing gibbous in two ways. First, the left side of the moon stays full instead of the right side. And second, it is visible at different times. It rises later at night and may still be visible for a time in the morning. About a week after the full moon, we are down to a half again. The waning half will be up for the second half of the night and the first half of the day, directly opposite of the waxing half. After the half, the moon continues shrinking as a waning crescent. Like the waxing crescent, the waning crescent is up mostly during the day, and as it gets closer to the sun, it is less and less likely that you will see it. The best time to see the waning crescent is before sunrise. It should be rising just before the sun in the east. This brings us back to the new moon, and the lunar month is complete. It is roughly a week from new to half, then from half to full, then from full back to half, and half back to new. So the whole cycle takes close to 4 weeks. Technically, it's slightly longer than that at 29.5 days. And from Wiki Commons, here are better images of the waxing and waning moon from Earth. I only showed the view from the northern hemisphere earlier, since that is both what I am most familiar with and what would have been familiar to people living in the Middle East region in Bible times. However, the view from the southern hemisphere is rotated about 180 degrees from that. Here are both views side by side for comparison. I do want to be clear that this is just a brief overview of the lunar cycle. There are things that I have skipped, and it's definitely simplified, but I hope it will be sufficient for our purposes of understanding the Jewish calendar. So with this understanding in mind, we're going to forge ahead, but with one more disclaimer. I am in no way an expert on the Jewish calendar. I am doing my best to represent it accurately, but it is complicated, and I am simplifying some of the finer points to try to make it easier to get the basics. Hopefully, it is accurate enough for our purposes. We'll start in January of 2024. Right away, we can see that the Jewish month of Shvat, colored in red, starts in the middle of the month of January with the new moon. Because days in the Jewish calendar start with sunset rather than midnight, I've let the color overlap slightly with the previous day. We should also note that the Jewish year doesn't start in January. This month is in the middle of the Jewish year AM 5784. As we move on in the year, we move to the months of Adar 1 and 2, followed by the month of Nisan. The month of Nisan is sort of the linchpin of the Jewish calendar. It is the first month of the year, though not the start of the new year, and contains the holiday of Passover, which is supposed to take place during the barley harvest. Because the lunar calendar is roughly 10 days shorter than the solar calendar, the month of Nisan would occur about 10 days earlier every year, and before long it would be nowhere near the barley harvest. To prevent that from happening, the second month of Adar is added in roughly every 3 years. 2024 was one such leap year. After Nisan, we have Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, and Elul, finally bringing us to the month of Tishrei. Tishrei is the 7th month of the calendar, but it is also the start of the new year, or Rosh Hashanah. This last October saw the start of the Jewish year AM 5785. Tishrei is followed by Cheshvan, Kislev, and Tevet, and then we are back to Shavat. Because of the added month of Adar in 2024, Shavat starts later in 2025 than the previous year, and 2025 holds only 1 month of Adar. With 2024 and 2025 side by side, you can see that, aside from the extra Adar, the same months are repeated, but all starting and ending at slightly different times. You should also see that the months all start and end right around the new moon and are either 29 or 30 days long. So far, we've only discussed 2 holidays, Passover and the New Year, or Rosh Hashanah, because those holidays directly affect the calendar. However, there are several other significant holidays, so we're going to use 2025's calendar to look at the holidays in the order in which they will occur. I'm specifically going to mention holidays that would have been significant in Jesus' life, so this will not be a complete look at all holidays currently in the Jewish calendar. If you are interested in that, I will put some links in the description. The first holiday or holy day we must mention is the Sabbath or Shabbat. Every week ends with a Shabbat celebration starting at sunset on Friday evening and ending after sunset on Saturday evening. There are several places in the Gospel where a Shabbat observance is mentioned, so we know this was a recurring day of rest in Jesus' life. Every month starts with a new moon and is marked by a minor holiday called Rosh Chodesh, the head of the month. The Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh holidays I have not marked on my calendar. Aside from these, there are several smaller holidays that I've left off my calendar, but most of the holidays that I have included are ones that would have been celebrated in Second Temple Judaism, as best I can tell. As I record this in January of 2025, we've already seen a couple holidays this year, but we'll see them again in December, so we'll skip over them for now. Our first holiday that is still coming up in 2025, that would have probably been of significance to Jesus, is in March, Purim or Purim. Purim means lots, after the casting of lots in the story of Esther. It commemorates the salvation of the Jewish people from the plots of Haman. We don't know for sure if or how Jesus celebrated Purim, but it's fairly likely that he did. A reasonable argument can be made that the unnamed festival in John 5:1 is Purim, though there are other possibilities, and we'll talk about that more later. You may notice a couple of holidays labeled with a Purim after the first. This is because Purim is celebrated differently in walled cities than in unwalled cities. It's complicated. We're going to leave it there. In April, we have Pesach, or Passover. It commemorates the events of the Exodus from Egypt. It is celebrated for 8 days, starts near a full moon. It also includes the Feast of Unleavened Bread and probably the Feast of First Fruits. We move through May and into June, where we see Shavuot, more commonly known to Christians as Pentecost. Shavuot means weeks. It was to be celebrated 7 weeks or 50 days after the festival of first fruits. We have a couple smaller holidays through July and August, but September brings us to the high holy days with Rosh Hashanah, the start of the new year 5786. This is also called the Feast of Trumpets. 10 days after that comes Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Those 10 days are called the 10 Days of Awe or Days of Repentance in preparation for Yom Kippur. After that is Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths. Sukkot, like Passover, starts at a full moon. It lasts 7 days and is followed by an assembly on the 8th day. Sukkot is the Hebrew word for tents or booths. The holiday commemorates the time of the Israelites living in tents in the wilderness. There's not much in November of this year, but December brings the celebration of Hanukkah. This celebration is not referenced in the Old Testament. Its origin seems to lie in the intertestamental era, and some account of it is given in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. It is also called the Feast of Dedication, since it commemorates the rededication of the temple after it had been defiled. John records Jesus visiting Jerusalem during this feast once in John 10:22. Like Passover, Hanukkah lasts 8 days. Unlike Passover and Sukkot, it starts during the last quarter of the moon cycle rather than around the full moon. And that brings us to the end of the year. The same holidays will repeat in 2026 on the same Jewish months and days, though they will fall differently on our Gregorian calendar. Here is a table with these holidays and the months of the Gregorian calendar that they generally fall in. So far, I have emphasized aligning the Jewish calendar with the Gregorian calendar and with the lunar cycle. It is important to remember that the Jewish calendar is also an agricultural calendar. Most of the main holidays occur around harvest times. I talked a little bit more about this in an earlier video. I will put a link. But here is the cycle of seasons as experienced in much of the Mediterranean region and roughly where the Jewish holidays align on that. You can see that the Passover happens at the barley harvest, Shavuot at the wheat harvest, and Sukkot and other fall holidays happen near the end of the fruit harvest. Significantly, Sukkot is the time when prayers for rain start being offered. I'm going to end the overview of the calendar here with another disclaimer that this is very simplified, and if you're interested in more details, I will put links in the description where you can find out more. We are going to swing back briefly to the Gospel of John for some application of these calendar lessons. One reason why understanding the Jewish calendar is helpful is because it can help us set a timeline for the events of Jesus' life. We've already mentioned that several feasts, including at least 3 Passovers, are mentioned in the book of John. If we assume the book is roughly chronological in order, which is an assumption, but if we assume that, we can lay out Jesus' ministry over 3 or 4 years. When ordering things by holidays, though, we do have one big question we have to consider before starting, and that is, what is the festival mentioned in John 5:1? And the answer is, we don't really know. It could be any of the festivals we've already mentioned. However, there are some clues that could help us make a more educated guess. First, we know that Jesus is in Jerusalem for this holiday. This could mean that it is one of the 3 holidays that were supposed to be celebrated in Jerusalem: Passover, Shavuot, or Sukkot. In addition, in chapter 4:35, Jesus makes a comment about a grain harvest being in 4 months. This comment would have made the most sense in the winter months, November, December, or January. And the next pilgrimage feast after the winter is Passover. I think this is the reason that several commentaries I have read suggest that this unnamed feast is actually a 4th Passover. If that were the case, the book of John must have taken place over roughly 4 years and looked something like this. Because of the somewhat oblique reference to the Feast of Tabernacles in John 1:14, I've put the start of Jesus' ministry in the month of Tishrei. But since the first definite holiday mentioned is Passover in chapter 2, verse 13, it could have started any time before the month of Nisan. Other people argue that Jesus didn't just visit Jerusalem for the pilgrimage feasts. For example, John 10:22 records his visit for Hanukkah. So the festival in 5:1 doesn't have to be a Passover or one of the other pilgrimage feasts. If we use the same clue about harvest in 4 months, it could be any winter holiday between the time when Jesus said that and when Passover is next mentioned in John 6:4. I think it's possible that it could be another Hanukkah, but I've heard better arguments made for Purim. If that's the case, our calendar of events looks more like this. Whichever of these calendars is more accurate, people have tried to use the information laid out in them to try to figure out the actual year of Jesus' death. This is far beyond the scope of what I want to cover today, but I think it helps support my claim that understanding the calendar is important and can have significant impact on our understanding of the Bible. Another reason I think understanding the calendar is important is because of the impact it can have on how we imagine events, which in turn impacts our understanding. Most of the second half of the book of John takes place around the time of Jesus' final Passover in Jerusalem. I've already done a video looking at the geography of Jerusalem and the places that Jesus visited during that time, but I think looking at the calendar gives us another type of insight into his last days. Because Jesus' last days were near Passover, we know several things. First, we know about the weather. It could have still been a little bit rainy, but in general, things were starting to dry up. Clouds would have been normal to see, but heavy clouds would have been a little bit unusual. Days tended to be warm, but nights could still be cold. Grass would still be fairly green, and flowers would still be blooming. It's a fairly pleasant time of year. We also know Jesus and his disciples would have had to cross the Kidron Valley several times during his last week. Since it was the end of the rainy season, it's very possible that at least a trickle of water was still running there. This would have tended to make for extra muddy and dirty feet. We also know, because it was Passover, that the moon would have been mostly full. So when Jesus and his disciples went from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane, they probably would have had a good amount of light for that trek. Also, when the women went to the tomb early in the morning, they should have had a waning gibbous moon to light their way. This also means that a lunar eclipse at this time is a possibility, but a solar eclipse would have been impossible, as those only happen during the new moon. I'm not sure about the level of food insecurity at that time, and it would have varied from year to year, but in an agrarian culture, I imagine that surviving the winter and making it to the next harvest is always worthy of celebration. People who had been running low on food would hopefully have a new crop of barley starting to come in, which would tend to improve the general mood. None of these things is groundbreaking in and of themselves, but I think they are helpful to think about. I think we often consider Jesus' last days solely in terms of their spiritual significance, and we forget that Jesus and his disciples experienced them physically. There is dirt-level reality in these stories. Jesus and his followers would have had wet, muddy feet from the last runoff of the spring rains. They would have been warm during the day, but felt the chill at night. They may have appreciated the increase of available food after months of rationing. They would have welcomed the light of the full moon when they were walking to the Garden of Gethsemane, but later on, they might have wished it were darker so they could hide from the soldiers who came. The holiday of Passover and all its cultural, traditional, and religious trappings would have been as familiar to them as Christmas is to us. We get a hint of snow in the air in November, and we start singing Christmas carols and hanging lights. As they lived out their lives, the disciples would have caught the scent of flowers or an olive tree under a full moon and would have been transported back to that night in Gethsemane when everything suddenly changed and Jesus added new meaning to those very old traditions. I think the point that I'm trying to make is the same one that I'm honestly always trying to make, that there is reality built into this account. There is the reality of mud, rain, harvest, a full moon that the author would have been imagining as he wrote the account of Jesus' last Passover. The author's lived experience helped determine the story he told and how he told it. When we skip too quickly to theology and application, we can miss the impact of the story. And when we forget about the dirt level context written into the account and read our own context into it instead, we can make some significant errors. So, if nothing else, I hope this video will help us to understand better the time and place of the story of Jesus. In my next video, I hope to finish up talking about the physical context of the second half of the Gospel of John, including a more summarized version of the geography and calendar, as well as a look at some of the imagery Jesus used in his lessons. So, if you're interested in that, please make sure you are subscribed so you can get notified when that comes out. And thank you for joining me as we learn together. Bye! Quick end note here, because one of my goals with this channel is to build a library of videos that people can use as a teaching resource, I am posting sections of this video as standalone videos. So if you are only interested in explaining the phases of the moon, or only need an introduction to the Jewish calendar, you can get those here. Can you say bye?
Bye.
Bye.